On behalf of iQuanti and the financial brand, welcome to Marketing That Performs, unlocking ROI across the financial customer journey. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Alex Chang. I'm the SVP and Head of Creative Services at iQuanti. I have a background in financial services, spent about a dozen years, mostly at American Express. For the past 15 years, I've worked in sports and entertainment marketing, most recently as the CMO of the San Francisco 49ers. I have a really special guest today. I'm really proud to introduce. His name is Michael Hartman. Extensive career, really impressive background. I'll let Michael speak to himself so I don't embarrass him. Michael, why don't you give us a little bit about your background to the audience?
Excellent. Thanks, Alex, for inviting me. So I've been doing marketing for the past 30 years for companies like PepsiCo, SeaWorld Parks, Chuck E. Cheese's, very prominent brands. But most relevant to the financial brand audience, I led direct-to-consumer marketing and third-party products at Mr. Cooper, which is the largest mortgage servicer in the US. And then I had a similar role as an interim basis at Onity Group, and they're known for their brands PHH Mortgage and Liberty Reverse Mortgage. So happy to be here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. So we've got a pretty packed agenda today, but really pertinent topics, I think, for everyone in the industry. So here's a quick rundown of what we're going to talk about today and really hear from Michael's experience. So number one, funnel to flywheel, and really thinking about how the consumer journey has changed. And we'll talk about that. Creative that clicks and converts. So how do you really start to develop creative that actually help driving your business and not just making art for art's sake? Personalization, obviously that's a really critical piece of marketing right now. So we'll talk about that a little bit and how that is shaping the industry. Test and learn. So this is something that's been around for a long time. I think how you test and what you can test and the velocity of that has really evolved. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, breaking silos. We all work in probably pretty large organizations that tend to get siloed. How do you break through some of that in order to really drive results for the organization? All right, Michael. So we'll start topic number one, funnel to the flywheel. Talk to us a little bit about your insights on the consumer journey, how that's evolved, and what marketers need to do to stay ahead.
Sure, Alex. So let's start with the obvious. You certainly can't treat everyone the same. So to the extent that you can model and segment your population, in mortgage, we did propensity models using internal and external third-party data to not just determine when we thought somebody might pay off their mortgage, but what are they likely to do next? Are they more likely to do a refi or purchase a new home? Because that's really important in terms of what kind of message you send to them. And then it's really important as an ultimate goal, if you can, try to track every marketing touch that you send out there and every consumer response. So in order to do that and really be effective, you also need to have an AI plan that generally will involve a tool or series of tools, because it's really impossible to mine all the data that you have for patterns with just the naked eye or even just, simple mathematical regression. And often you can get, just for starters, you can get that AI tool. It might be part of your website CMS, or it might be part of your CRM, or your automation tool might have an AI journey, and don't be afraid to turn that on. Next, I would say that journeys are the key. It's all about helping your customer, especially in financial services. They're not going to do these transactions very often. So if you can't help them, don't bug them or spam them with messages that aren't relative. So some important journeys. Onboarding is really important, because that's when your customer is the most responsive to your messages. They're not tuning it out like wallpaper. So if there's certain things that you want to let them know that you do as a business, probably in that onboarding journey, that's the important time to do it. An anniversary of purchase is another opportunity to get back with your customers. Usually on a predetermined basis, the best product or fit is important to know where you can save somebody money. And then lastly would be the next best action. And so that is generally based on what the consumer is doing. So based on website data, their search data, their email activity, if they're looking at something different, you don't want to send them a message that's a total disconnect. If you want to get next level after that, there are vendors like Conversant is one, where you can see where your customer is going to websites that are not yours. So when they leave your website, what else are they doing? Now, that's certainly going to be on an anonymized basis, and they're only going to tell you general content categories that they're looking at versus actual websites that they're going to. But that's a great way to know whether they're looking at alternatives to you or just, life changes. If somebody's going to be going to college or they're about to be an empty nester or have a baby, those are important things in financial services to know about your customers. So that's what I'd say from the beginning. Alex, any other thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting you talked about, the tools today that allow us to really create these journeys, right, and map these out, because all the digital touch points, right, which didn't necessarily exist in an analog world. I guess, Michael, how do you think about not getting paralyzed by all of that data? Because there are literally infinite number of journeys. So what are some tips you have in terms of folks thinking through how do they start to prioritize, categorize, and make it something where, yes, it's informed, but it's still digestible and then most importantly, actionable by a company?
Yeah, great question. What I usually think of, I always say concentric circles. So think of bullseye. And what is, there could be, 13 or 15 journeys that you have, but what is the one or two that you absolutely have to do on day one? And then you kind of go out from there based on, its size of the prize, its the life cycle of where the customer is, and you chunk it out that way, because there's no way that you can attack those all at once. I mean, to get to 15 journeys, that took us multiple years to really determine. And quite frankly, we didn't know some of the journeys until we started getting into that data. So I always say, just start chewing and, and keep going.
I like that. No, I love just start chewing. That's awesome. I think one thing I'll add to this in terms of thinking about the funnel, I think historically people think through the funnel as things that we can control, right? So think about own channels, thinking about paid. And what I've discovered more and more is, in my experience, is that more and more decisions are being made outside of the domain that you own, right? So and think about earned channels and think about influencers and other folks who are maybe talking about your brand or interacting in your category, but aren't directly in your control. And I think a lot of times discovery as well as opinion forming, loyalty, all that actually starts in those types of places as well. So I think when you think about kind of what are the components of the funnel and where do you need to be active and where do you need to be monitoring, I think it goes beyond what you own. And you have to look outside of that as well, because I think those are really becoming more and more influential, especially with younger audiences.
Great.
All right. Let's go to the next topic here. Okay, let's talk about creative, right? So this is my world a little bit in terms of head of creative services here. But as I said before, I like this phrase, and I use it a lot, is that we're not making art for art's sake, right? Ultimately, our goal is to make sure that we have creative that's actually converting. So Michael, let's talk about that a little bit. Talk about your thoughts on creative. How do you really approach it in a way that is driving results for organizations?
Sure. So in a perfect world, you've got to measure the success of each creative unit, whether that's digital or traditional media. So one of the things that we looked at was the response rate. So is it getting people to do something, and then ultimately converting? Because you might get somebody to respond, but the conversion and the pull through might not be good. So in mortgage, we were looking at 150 plus units every month just to see how they were doing. The next thing I'd say related to that is be careful on the type of messaging. Don't forget about brand messaging. A lot of people are always, what's the offer? What's the deal? What's my sale? And from my experience, those kind of promotional messages take longer to resonate. They need extra frequency, and they don't always perform as good as just an overall brand message. So it's important that you have a mixture in there, but certainly don't forget about brand. Second thing I'd say is you've got to constantly change that creative, at least quarterly, if not monthly, especially if you're hitting the same people with the same messages every single month. And there's tools out there. Certainly AI helps with that. There's a lot of ways that you can change your creative or just change the headline, subject line, call to action, body copy, or, things like Canva is, a cheap way to be able to do some of that. And they have AI built into it. Next, I would say is always have champion, challenger, creative. So split your population. And that doesn't mean it has to be a 50-50 always. If there's some risk, if you've got a really good champion and you don't want to risk, your month's volume by splitting it 50-50, if there's enough impressions out there, you can split it 80-20 or 70-30. But, making sure that you do that. There's also some agencies out there, especially in the AI world, that can help do much more elaborate instead of 50-50. We were doing 16 cell tests where you were looking at the headline, the subhead, the picture, the body copy, the call to action, the subject line, and basically Frankensteining all those different things and determining which one works the best. And a company like that, Prasado is a company that can help out. Next, I would say be channel agnostic. You just don't know what's going to work in a particular message. So be ready to move your channels, especially if they're siloed. If somebody only owns social and somebody else owns SEM, or the various social channels are broken out, you have to go with the flow. So, for example, at Chuck E. Cheese's, we found out that food did better in standard display, but birthdays worked better in Facebook. So we moved the money around depending on what we needed to make sure that we were using the best channels and not being locked into a particular budget or channel. I like to look at the competition and see what they're doing. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it right, but if they're doing it constantly and repeatedly, then chances are they've got some metrics that say it's working. So Competiscan is somebody in financial services that you can see both traditional and digital media that's very affordable and cool. Just on the free side, Facebook, if you go to their ads, ads/library, or Google, if you go to their adstransparency.google and put in your competitors' names, you can see all their ad units. So I think that's just a good way of knowing at least how people are reaching out to customers and what language they might be using. Like in mortgage, we always are like, do people understand what cash out really means? Versus we definitely know they know what refinance means. Next, video is king. It's been that way for quite some time, and it's even more prevalent. Who wants to read if they can get a short little video? And be careful not to overwhelm people with 3-minute videos. If you can do it in 15 seconds, that's great. Linear TV, connected TV, over the top, that still has the most engagement in terms of seconds, even though sometimes it's harder to measure the results of linear TV. To me, in financial services, customized videos get great responses, and that's customized to each customer. So Adomu is a vendor that can help in something like that. And then lastly, for video, you absolutely, it's not just all Facebook. Even if your customers are older, you've got to have a plan for YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and make sure that, you're not spreading yourself too thin, that you've done sufficiently in each of those before you move on to the next one, but you got to have a plan for it. And then the last thing I'll say is you're going to have to augment organic content. All those companies choke your organic content to either a certain or a massive extent. So don't think your organic content is going to be seen if you don't have a paid component to it as well. Alex, what's your experience been in this?
Yeah, I think for me, the most exciting thing that's happening right now in the creative space is AI, right? And all these tools and platforms that are emerging now that are allowing companies like ours to develop creative with velocity at scale and high quality for our clients. I think when you talk about, the testing and iteration being across all these different channels that, where you have consumer touch points, that requires a lot of creative. And those outputs, I think, historically may have been difficult to manage just because of the sheer volume and the amount of iteration and testing and optimizing that you're doing. And I think that's changing now. And certainly it's still relatively early days, but the innovation in the AI production space is happening really quickly. And so it's something that my team is leaning into quite heavily. And we're really embracing all those tools because we think they can actually really help accelerate creative production, ultimately results for the clients. And the second thing that I'll add is on the bottom here, kind of one brand, one voice. And so I've worked in kind of different capacities from our perspective. So I've worked in new customer acquisition, I've worked in brand marketing and advertising. And I think what the reality is even though we kind of think about our teams that way, we think about our companies that way, and maybe think about even our creative that way, consumers don't. And so they don't differentiate between what's brand creative and what's product creative, what's, acquisition, what's loyalty. It's all coming from your brand. And so I think consistency and branding and storytelling and voice, tone, and thinking through kind of messaging and making sure that everything feels like it's coming from one place is important because to the consumer it is.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, let's talk about personalization. And you touched on this a little bit before, kind of in the first topic. We talked about understanding kind of journeys a little bit, but let's talk about personalization specifically and kind of what that looks like.
Sure. Well, it goes without saying, but customers want to know that you know them. They don't want superfluous messages, especially if they've, done stuff on your website or, logged in. It's really important that that you're recognizing them. So, you've got to protect their information. That means certain times you've got to, unsubscribe somebody or even understand what Google is taking from your actions. So for example, in healthcare, the things that Google was grabbing, was more than what we even realized. So there's tools out there that can help you anonymize what you're sending back to Google or to YouTube, and they can still optimize, but you're sending them less information. Next, it's really important, again, personalization, before and after scenarios in financial services or savings messages. If you can pre-price or know how much you can save somebody, whether it's a mortgage or an insurance or a credit card interest rate, those kinds of scenarios are very well appreciated. And if you can't, just acknowledging, just putting the interest rate that they currently have when it came to mortgage, a lot of people didn't realize, how high their interest rate was because it was something they had done so long ago. So what we would see is people who had a high interest rate who saw it would respond greater to, our display activity that was on our own website than, somebody who had a lower interest rate and that it wasn't listed there. So again, your CRM or your CMS tool is your friend there. A lot of them have built-in journeys or built-in next best action. It's always difficult to say that one. And, we talked about journeys, but you gotta have, those journeys and think about them. So for example, if somebody is paying off their credit card every month, or if somebody is paying off their mortgage, what are you gonna do next? What's your multi-channel effort to try and retain that customer if they're going to pay off that mortgage so that you can recapture them? A lot of times people talk about, we've sent this person 12 emails and they haven't opened a single one. And that's true because often we're sending too many, but it's not a lost cause. One thing that I have found that you can re-engage those folks with the sweepstakes. It can't just be something silly that's unrelated to your product. It could be something about, win a free mortgage payment or something like that. But you can get them to re-engage in your content, even if they haven't opened emails for a year. So don't think that they're always lost before you purge them. Alex, how about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about the relationship, right, that you have with your end customer. And of course, a lot of huge companies, I'm sure, on this webinar now, and you've got, tens, hundreds, thousands of customers. And so it's hard to think about it as a one-to-one relationship. The reality is that's what you're trying to build, right? One thing that I discovered when I worked in sports is that, the relationship with, in our case, the fan, it was something that was pretty deep, right? Pretty meaningful because their fandom, for in my case, the 49ers, was a big part of their identity. It's part of kind of who they were. And so we thought about those relationships as one-to-one, even though they weren't treated as one-to-one. And what that does is it changes a little bit in terms of how you think about your interactions with folks. And you think about what level of personalization you are able to provide, right? And what's realistic and how can you start to make it feel personal, because ultimately to them it is. And so I think a lot of it, when I think about personalization is, and you touched on this, Michael, in your comments, is look at it from their perspective, right? Kind of think about what their experience is, not just what you know about them necessarily, but also how are they feeling about you, good, bad, or ugly, right? And see if you can change the experience for them in a way that recognizes that. All right. Okay, so you've touched on this quite a bit, so I get the sense that this is probably something that you're very passionate about, but I heard a lot in your comments about testing and learning and different cells and all that, so I'll let you jump in.
Sure. So, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you've got to personalize with the data that you have available. So that could be their current interest rate, debt examples, the length of their relationship, their monthly or lifetime savings, or real estate data, is often very interesting if you can pull that in, the value of the property or what other houses are selling for. Next, I would say absolutely have to have a monthly test and learn plan for every channel. No channel gets off. You can't just say, oh, let the digital people or the email people test. Your direct mail person has to have a testing plan, etc. So for me, for example, the first time I worked with iQuanti was at Chuck E. Cheese's, and iQuanti helped us with A/B website testing. We just didn't have the capacity in-house for creative and technical to make those changes to the website. And so that was really important. So they did, a dozen tests for us, and, almost all of them were successful. So, and again, making sure that you're going offline and online in your testing strategy. I'll repeat this again, use AI to see patterns that are not evident. One of the things that surprised me, I'm a big hacker of copy. Get the shortest headline, the shortest body copy. People don't like to read. Make it as pithy as possible. But what I saw on this AI testing and machine learning was more body copy actually helped, and it blew me away that did better. And it allows you to do what I call implied personalization. You've been selected. Or collective action or fear of missing out. Customers like you have refied or have gotten cash out, out of your home. So those things are important. And then last, I would say, is you've got to be optimized for SEO. If no one can find your website or blog content, it's useless. So you've got to have a strategy for how that is discoverable. And Alex, I know that iQuanti can also help with that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point, that ultimately discoverability is critical in our space. And that's something we're looking at now. SEO is where iQuanti made their name. I think the next frontier of that, and we're calling it GEO, so generative engine optimization, right? So how you show up in AI overviews, how do you show up in the LLMs? Because ultimately now that's how people are searching for information. It's a totally new world. It's funny, I think about my kid, my oldest is 15 now, so he's, digitally savvy enough. We've kind of limited to some degree, but he's enough to have gone from Googling for information to using TikTok to now using ChatGPT, right? So he's gone through kind of like already 3 stages of how people search for information, and he's he's pretty young. And so I think that will continue to evolve, but discoverability is key.
Yeah. If you don't have GEO on your, in a presentation somewhere and in a plan, you're going to be behind very soon. So that is absolutely key. I agree.
Absolutely. When you talked about testing and you talked about kind of making sure it's part of the DNA or the fabric of an organization, and testing monthly across every channel, and no one gets off on, on that, everyone's going to hold accountable to it. I guess, how do you action that in a situation where people are just, they're tasked with driving numbers and getting results and kind of, keeping the lights on, and you layer on top of that testing? What have you seen? Is it better to then take that, kind of that testing responsibility and you have a dedicated team? Do you work with agencies like ours? I guess, what have you seen and what's most successful in that? Because I think it is critical, but it's also, if you have a channel manager who's also responsible for, short-term, medium-term outcomes, it's a lot to kind of layer on top. And then probably a lot of times it's a thing that gets kind of pushed to the wayside because it isn't necessarily immediate.
Yeah, it's tough, but I generally like it interwoven into the day-to-day people as opposed to a separate team. A separate team can handle that really, um, crazier kind of innovation or new vendors that you're trying to get on board. But we just started, okay, you're going to do one test a month. Then once we manage that, okay, I think these channels can handle 2 tests a month because we could get, the same or double the test for the same amount with the vendor. So it just kind of grew as time went on. And, that's what your one-on-ones are for. What do we need to know next? What's getting stale? As you start to look at the response rates, you'll know what creative's getting stale. And therefore, you've got to have some stuff. You got to plant some seeds for the future and have a library of stuff that you're just ready to drop in a champion challenger basis.
Makes sense. Okay, so this is our final topic. Let's talk about silos, or as I said before, I think most folks on this webinar, and your experience, mine as well, big global organizations, lots of teams, different focuses, et cetera. How do you unify all of that? And I would love your perspective, of having overseen an entire marketing organization, across, how do you think through breaking silos in order to get to better outcomes?
Yeah, measurement is key. You gotta measure stuff to really know. And this is one that, often gets shortchanged too. So I think it's important that your, day-to-day people are measuring, but this is one where I feel like sometimes some specialty, an analytics team can really help, publish things on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to help the core team on it. But, for me, the first thing is you got to decide where you go deep on content and where you skinny it down to maximize funnel conversion. Big mistake I've seen people do is have way too much content because they're like, well, we don't know if people know about the product and stuff. But usually what happens is the more content you put, or if you're putting your call to actions below the fold, you're going to hurt your lead conversion. So, you got to try and do stuff side by side or have some of the content expandable or, have the content be below and have a lead form at the top. Another thing that I would say is you always have to have in financial services a quick call button that either floats with you or is at the bottom, within a thumb's reach on a phone, or a lead form that's side by side with the content, because you just don't want the content to distract from your lead volume. And I'm still not, a magician when it comes to the right mixture. And a lot of times it's failure and trying to figure out what the best mix is in that situation. Another mistake I see people make is on their blogs, they have no CTAs or no phone numbers or anything. They're like, oh, this is just a learning center. Well, your learning center should be a huge lead source for you. There's not that many people who go to it. So it's got to work beyond just the content itself. You have to have a plan for abandoners, especially in financial services, whether it's a lead form, somebody abandoning or what have you. The majority of people are going to opt out and not complete what you're asking them to do. So, for example, if you have online self-service tools, 90% of those folks are going to abandon. So what are you doing? After X number of minutes, is somebody calling those people? Is your Salesforce reaching out to them, or a third-party outbound telemarketer? Or if you're trying to do appointment booking, which seems like it would be great, let's, save everybody time, have appointments, you get 30, 40, 50% no-shows. So are you reminding people of their appointments, but also not having that be the be all end all, of things, especially when it's office hours and you have your salespeople there, there's nothing that beats a live phone call. I'm, saying the obvious there. You've got to know your lead zones, especially in anything that you own, your web, site and your app and your social, and knowing what are the top 20 or 30 or however many takes you to get to 80 or 90% of your daily or weekly lead volume, and know each one of those and then measure them. And if you know that your leads are down or they're doing really well, knowing where they are, people always panic when you're missing, but you know which ones are really delivering so that you can really lean into those. Related to that, in terms of your own channels, is definitely get a heat map on your website. You'll be shocked at how little your folks are scrolling, and so how important that first top of screen is, and maximizing your navigation. And so there's some pretty cheap ones out there. I like Hotjar as one that's out there to help you for those. And then finally, on measuring success, just a few more thoughts. You got to have a couple of dashboards, probably one for your executives or whoever you report to, and one for the marketing team. What the marketing team needs to measure is not as much as you need to show your executive team. So be careful not to put too many things on one page that can get distracting to your senior leaders, but making sure that you're measuring all that's important for the marketing team. We talked about measuring the creative unit. You got to know your metrics. Follow the cash. Know how much you make off of a customer. What's your year one profit? What's your lifetime value for a new acquisition? And then know what your preferred acquisition cost is going to be by channel, knowing your pull through for each channel, so that you know what you can afford to pay. And then it's how do you constantly lower the bar and get high quality leads that convert for lower than what your preferred acquisition cost is. A/B testing, we talked about that. As you start to get really sophisticated, things like marketing mix modeling and multi-touch attribution are available. iQuanti can help with MMM, and there's other people out there that can do that as well. But my advice here is, a lot of people just put in their digital data and they don't put in their offline stuff. So when you're doing a PR release, should be in there. All your GRPs for TV, anything that you're doing should be in those models. And then last is, you're never going to know. Some of these models can give you a little bit of a false positive. The best way is to do some holdout tests. And I know it's risky, especially when lead volume's critical every day, but holding out people from certain channels or certain units, that's really what you're going to see, especially in SEO. What is SEO delivering from SEM, and the combination of those two? Doing a holdout test is key. Alex, what would your final thoughts be on measurement?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back on what we originally started with, I think prioritizing what you're measuring and know why you're measuring it, and make sure that's actionable, right? You can measure literally everything, but if you're not going to be able to interpret what it means, or more importantly, do something about it, then you probably have to question why you're measuring it to begin with. And so I think that's something that constantly has to be challenged to some degree, because ultimately, if you don't, there's going to be, sort of this analysis paralysis type situation that happens. And the last thing I would say here in terms of this topic on, breaking silos, boosting outcomes, and you see again the last bullet there, aligning the team, aligning the journey. I think ultimately, no matter what kind of part of an organization you sit in, there needs to be something that's pulling everyone together, say we're all marching towards the same North Star, right? And I think that's something that then, if you understand that, can help you think about day to day tactically, why the things you're doing what you're doing, like what are they building towards, even though they're different maybe than what the group next to you is doing. Ultimately, you need to be aligned towards some common mission or goal, right? So again, I'll use my 49ers example. Our mission was to create meaningful moments that inspire and connect, right? And those moments could have been things that were in my control as CMO, so things like our social media, our content, our game day experience, or influencer marketing program, our retail program. But it also could be things that are completely out of my control, right? So things related to what we're doing on the, maybe on our sponsorship side, or what we're doing in terms of our, non-NFL events. So there are a lot of things that are kind of involved towards a mission, not just the things that are within marketing. And I think as long as everyone is on the same page and understands those things and what their role is in contributing towards that mission, then you'll have better alignment and you'll have hopefully less silos.
Sure. Your first comment made me think of one other thing too. A lot of times in measurement, there's a lot of what's on that page, but there's not a why. and more importantly, what are the implications? What's next because of what you're seeing? So if you can't answer, why and what's next, then your measurement probably isn't sufficient.
Yep, that's a great point. All right. So, Michael, this has been hugely helpful. I know that you have to run, but thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Alex.
Thanks, Michael. Hey. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to do a quick poll and then we'll get to the Q&A. So if you're able to stick around, that'll be awesome. Let me do the poll first. Just pull it up real quick. Okay, so here's the poll question. You can answer on your screen as well. Which area would move the needle most for you for your marketing ROI? Customer journey design and segmentation, creative effectiveness across channels, personalization and data activation, or cross-channel integration and campaign optimization. So we'll give it a few moments here for you guys to answer the question, and then let's see kind of where we net out. Sharing that. Okay, so let's see here. All right, interesting. So we've got kind of two clear winners here, I think, with cross-channel integration, personalization, journeys coming second, then way back in the field is creative effectiveness across channels. Okay, that's pretty interesting. So, I think for me, that makes sense. I think all of them ultimately are important for sure. Coming from the creative space, my heart hurts a little bit. I think creative optimization is important, but I think, obviously at the end of the day, I think all those things really matter and can help move the needle when it comes to marketing. All right, so last thing, let me look at the Q&A real quick and see what's here. All right, so we've got 3 questions in here, and feel free to jump in and add any more that you might have. So, perspective on AI impact on FinServ marketing. Yeah, I touched on this a little bit earlier. I mean, I think it's absolutely transforming the industry. I'll just say that. I mean, you guys have seen it for yourself every day. You're seeing new examples of tools coming out and the kind of marketing assets that are being created, type of intelligence that's being created. It's phenomenal, honestly. And I think there are definitely mixed feelings, at least in the creative world, about AI. I think it's somewhat polarizing. I think there are folks who feel like it's taking away from creativity and kind of taking away from the human element of creative. I personally don't believe that. I think it's actually going to unlock additional creative. I think it allows people to really focus on developing the best ideas. Just how they do it just is faster, frankly, and I think iteration is faster. Ultimately, I think the skill that's going to emerge is that you still need to have great taste and be able to curate. And so you apply that to what you're using in terms of tools and prompting and all of that. But if you don't have the ability to curate and you don't have great taste to understand, like, this is good and this is where we need to be, this is good, better, best when it comes to what's right for my brand, then you're still going to have a struggle there. If you can do that, I think you're going to excel. But I think just the volume and the rate and frankly the effectiveness and the efficiency of creative is going to transform tremendously. It already is. And so that's something I'm personally kind of really excited about and really leaning into, and my team is as well. Next question is, are there any lessons from sports marketing that apply to banks? Yeah, I mean, they're very different industries, so I think there are some lessons for sure. I think one that comes to mind is that you can't plan for the unexpected. That you control what you control. So like when I worked in sports marketing, for example, we controlled a lot of things, but I didn't control probably the thing that mattered the most, which is wins and losses, right? So my team had nothing to do with how we performed on the field. Now, I was lucky, I was there for 5 seasons and we won more games than we lost, but we had some tough seasons in there as well. And we had some tough losses through those seasons. And when that happens, you're naturally going to see a dip in terms of brand perception, brand engagement. You're going to see in sales, et cetera, things are going to take a dip, and you have to be able to kind of adjust to that, right? There are weird things that happen in sports, for example, like injuries. That are unexpected, but you have to adapt to. And they're positive things too. I remember we made a huge trade unexpected for Christian McCaffrey a few seasons ago. And that was a huge win for us, not just on the field, but from a marketing standpoint, right? And from a sales standpoint. And so we had to pivot and capitalize very quickly. And I think financial services is the exact same way, right? And you guys are in the business and you've seen the ups and downs and things that can happen at the macroeconomic factor, but locally, et cetera, that can really impact your business and some things you can't necessarily predict. And you have to be ready to adjust for those. So I would say kind of, prepare for the unexpected. What have you seen in behaviors around how consumers use AI for traditional search? Yeah, I talked about this before again as well. I think, AI search, AI overviews, generative engine optimization, whichever, kind of catchphrase you want to use for it, again, is transforming how consumers discover, research, and make purchase decisions. And I know that I'm sure you're all using it every day. I'm using it every day as well. It's currently changing my life, both within the office and outside of it. There's going to be an entirely new field of kind of marketing expertise, and we're proud to lead this area called around GEO, generative optimization. It's probably the next wave of SEO. And how do you make sure that information that you need to get to consumers when they're looking for relevant information surfaces, right? How are you going to be a cited source? How are you going to be someone that's being referenced? How are your brand actually going to show up in the results themselves? So there are clear strategies around that, and they continue to evolve over time. Again, this agency made their mark developing a proprietary model that could really replicate Google search, right? And help you surface there in a really scientific and predictable way. And we're doing the same thing for generative optimization. So really exciting space. The next question, how to factor, this is for Michael. So he did have to take off. So we'll kind of hold that next question. We'll pass it along to him and make sure we get that answer back to everyone. And then the final question, where would you start to make sure that your whole team is on the same page in different departments? Yeah, that's a great question. I think start with leadership first if you can, because I think that tends to kind of move the needle the most. And I think also allow those folks, as well as interested parties, to get involved in shaping that direction, right? I remember when I started one of my roles in a leadership position, I had a kind of a leadership team working with me. There are some folks that really leaned into developing a new strategy and some that kind of leaned away. And so you kind of recognize that and say, for the folks that are leaning in, give them that ability to have some skin in the game. And the folks that are leaning away from you, find out why, right? And really dig into it. Because ultimately you want everyone to get on board willingly. And if they have some skin in the game, I think that's a lot easier to do. All right. So I think that concludes the questions. If there's nothing else, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Financial Brand as well. Have a great rest of your week, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Take care.